Welcome, everyone. We'll give folks a moment to join who've pre-registered, and we'll begin in approximately 1 minute. Welcome, everyone, to Trauma-Informed Supervision, hosted by C4 Consulting. My name is Jonathan DiCarlo, and I'm CEO of C4 Consulting, and joined by my co-facilitator this morning, Mary Woods.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome.
We want to acknowledge our disclosure at this point and say that we have nothing to disclose for financially relevant relationships with any commercial interests. Before we dive right in, we invite you to join us in a brief grounding exercise. So comfortably seating in your chair or standing if you're roaming around your space, we invite you to take a deep breath in through your nose and let it out through your mouth. We invite you to take another deeper breath in through your nose, hold it for a moment, and let it out through your mouth with a sigh. We invite you to take a deeper breath in through your nose, hold it for as long as you're comfortable, and let it out with a loud sigh. And lastly, we invite you to take as deep a breath in as you're comfortable with, hold it for as long as you choose, and let it out with as loud a sigh as possible. We'll give a moment for those who are still holding their breath to let out that last sigh. Mary, would you like to review the agenda for everyone?
Yes, well, good afternoon, everyone. Our agenda for today is to discuss the role of supervision in producing a trauma-informed environment and identifying 3 ways an organization can create a trauma-informed supervision practice and examine best practices and solutions to create a sustainable trauma-informed workplace. And hopefully we'll have an interactive discussion through our question and answers at the end of our presentation.
Please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A throughout the process, and we'll try and make time to address them at the end. And remember, there'll be a brief poll at the end to provide feedback for today's time. Diving right in, we want to acknowledge the role of trauma in our world and in our lives. And we use this stool representation to be able to talk about how trauma exists for everyone involved in a care process, for clients, for staff, and for an organization. And that each area and each component of a community experiences trauma differently and has those opportunities show up differently in a process. So really being able to have awareness of the power of trauma and the healing opportunities that exist, regardless of what type of treatment or service is being provided, is really essential in understanding clients' needs and understanding the role of trauma for staff, and in particular, the role of trauma for an organization.
So most organizations really want to support their staff, and if they have to balance that between viability and billable hours and administrative supervision with how do you create truly trauma-informed supervision that focuses on the development of your staff. So there are both challenges and opportunities in terms of the organizational the organization really needs to be aware that trauma not only affects the clients and the participants, but it also affects the staff, and that they need to be able to have a lens to see through some of the things that are happening within the work environment that may be trauma induced. And staff need to be aware of their own vicarious trauma, which we're going to talk, or their actual trauma that they've experienced. And we need to have awareness that clients all come to us with some form of trauma. So, you know, the road is paved with good intentions, but we don't always end up where we want to be. So this presentation is really going to focus on organization and the supervisee role, more so than the actual implementation of a trauma-informed care.
So we briefly review the principles of trauma-informed care, beginning with safety. So ensuring a physical and emotional environment for organization and staffs, participants, families, and communities. When we talk about safety, we're not always aware of the psychological components and the elements of safety that we assume are present for a provider or for staff and participants and families in a setting. When we look at trustworthiness and transparency, we really want to be able to look at what are the relationships and the foundation of safety, building into trust in the relationships at every level of an organization and for staff with our clients and families. So making tasks clear and maintaining appropriate boundaries is critical to be able to deliver this with integrity. When we talk about peer support, it's really the key to really building trust, establishing safety, and being able to empower change through peer-to-peer engagement. When we talk specifically about trauma-informed care supervision, we're talking about the opportunities for staff to be able to support each other at every level throughout an organization, not just clinician to clinician, but every department, every sector, and every segment, really eliminating the silos that often exist. We speak of collaboration, about maximizing collaboration and the sharing of power with participants. And when we say participants, we mean everyone throughout an organization, whether that's leadership, clients, staff, vendors, referrals, families, and the community.
So we're looking at how do we empower and give voice and choice to our staff. Obviously, we do that with our participants, but when we think about an organization, how do we prioritize empowerment and skill building, as well as prioritizing participant choice and control? So, you know, how many organizations where there's a staff advisory group, where there's really staff input when there's a grant that's being considered? You know, how siloed are the decisions from the people that are then going to be responsible for implementing those grants or those evidence-based practices? And then when we have cultural humility, that differs from cultural competence by centering on an individual's cultural experience as a reference and honoring and attending to the individual's cultural context and influences in their care. And that goes between a supervisee and a supervisor, as well as the organization. Do we really understand the culture that our staff brings to us, whether it's you know, somebody from Haiti or somebody from, you know, Northern Ireland? Do we really understand what that person brings to the work environment? And then having mutual responsibility, so each person's responsible for their part in the relationship and for their own behavior, and not making assumptions that based on stereotypes. Having a conversation with your coworker about, you know, what is your experience? What is your family's experience? Because every family has its own culture within the bigger culture. And then having compassion and looking at the entirety of the person, including their own experiences and environments, rather than being judgmental and dismissive. You know, having compassion for the people we work with and the people we supervise, and really being able to see them as something other than the extension of the billable hours and a slot that needs to get filled in order to provide the care.
So when we talk about core principles and applications for staff support, we want to highlight some opportunities to really look at how does trauma-informed care principles apply in practice. So we begin with safety by thinking about opportunities, for example, of critical incident debriefing and other protocols. How inclusive and how safe and how open are these debriefing opportunities? How widely are they shared to be able to be invitational? As you'll notice in our breathing exercise, we used very specific language to say we invite you to this process. So when we think about safety and we look at the application of it, how safe are these processes and how involved are they with everyone in the organization?
When we think about trustworthiness and transparency, the importance of having ongoing communication and very clear practices so that we do what we say we're going to do, and that we have integrity to our decision-making process, and really understanding how safe is it for me to admit as a staff person that I'm really struggling with the care of my elderly mother, and you know, that's really taking its toll on me. But there's an expectation that you need to be on call, and that's part of your job. You know, how much safety is there to really be transparent in an organization, and do staff trust that if I do share at that level, I'm going to be respected, and hopefully the organization is going to help me problem solve whatever I'm experiencing.
When we look at opportunity to grow choice, are staff involved in the decision making? For example, with trauma-informed supervision, is the supervision style appropriate for the particular staff member, or is the organization only using one directive style of supervision, whether that's administrative or clinical? So how much input does the staff have in decision making in their own process, as well as the client care process? So being able to look at opportunities to grow staff involvement in choice and feedback is not just feedback-informed therapy, which, you know, as an evidence-based practice shows incredible results. But how often are we using that same process for including choice and feedback from staff involved in all decision-making in an organization?
And that there's true collaboration between administration and staff, so that when there are challenges, they can be identified, and that there's a group that engages in solutions. So it's really seen as a team, and that the collaboration flows both ways.
With empowerment, our staff encouraged to grow and provide feedback. And what we mean in this example is really to look at how do we support staff growth in the supervision process administratively and clinically? How do we look at being able to help a provider grow their skills as a staff member, to diversify their opportunities for supporting the people they serve, both in other staff in the organization and clients and families within the community, as well as being able to look at opportunities to grow within an organization in terms of role opportunity and cross-training. When we look at feedback, do we really account for the empowered opportunity for staff to say, do the benefits that I engage in as an employee in this organization really serve my needs? And if they don't, what are the opportunities for me to be able to receive the kind of care and the kind of support from an organization to be able to employ the things that come out of a supervision process, both administratively and clinically?
When we think about cultural humility, as I said earlier, it's important to understand that person's experience within their family of origin and their culture, but then within the greater culture. I live in a city that's been designated as a refugee designation. We get a lot of folks that are invited to come to our city and start anew. And so there was a point in time where we were getting a lot of people from Eastern Europe, some that were both Bosnians and Serbians, and that created chaos in the high school. And we all need to understand the cultural differences, and I mean like hundreds of years of cultural differences between these two groups that both came from quote unquote Czechoslovakia. So I think, it's really important not to assume that we know. I come from an Irish background, so my perception of things is through my family's experience being, second generation people from Ireland. So it's just important that we all have those great conversations and learn kind of the history of who we're working with and understanding maybe why they react the way they do. Could just be part of their culture.
Right? So maintaining that context always being critical. And in this process, being able to be mutually responsible. So we borrow from the 12-step example of one wrong promptly admitted. So when we speak of mutual responsibility, we're really looking at the application of all of the other principles of trauma-informed care integrated into an opportunity, where each part of the relationship is identified and everybody involved is able to look at the opportunities for growth. So when we make a mistake or we make a choice that doesn't have the outcome that we really seek, can we own that portion of it? Can we come back to the relationship as staff within an organization, and not just in supervision, but everywhere in the process, with clients, with family members, with each other and peer support, to really be able to look at how we own our part of a relationship and how we contribute to it. A key opportunity in the application of client care with mutual responsibility is to ask the simple question, does your organization use a behavior contract or a mutual responsibility agreement? Because it's not just a language game, but it really is the clear identification of who's responsible for what part of the relationship together.
I would piggyback on that and say, do you have a supervision plan with your supervisee or your supervisor? And do you have very distinct goals that you're trying to reach, be it licensing or certification or just increased knowledge in a specialty? I think that, it's just as much the staff's responsibility as it is the organization's to develop those types of ongoing contracts, if you will. And I think, last but not least, of course, is compassion and, really seeking to understand rather than assume or judge. I was talking to someone I was supervising this morning who's, compared to me, relatively new in her career, and she was saying, I'm really uncomfortable saying I don't know something, and being able as a supervisor to give people permission to say, it's okay not to know things. I mean, it's okay to be that vulnerable. Because you get a license doesn't mean you've already been anointed with all of this incredible knowledge. This is an ongoing process. Accumulating skills and knowledge is ongoing. And in a trauma-informed supervision, it's important to create an environment where your supervisees really feel comfortable saying, I think, I don't really know this, or, I think I just, messed this up because my client just left here really angry. And so that's crucial, I think.
So we want to begin looking deeper at trauma-informed care and supervision, and being able to look at this process by identifying the trauma impacts and the opportunities for self-care. So when we talk about this, we need to be able to understand, as we've identified, what are the primary traumas that staff members come in to work with in their lives? And what is the healing journey for them been to date? What are the opportunities and experiences of secondary trauma or vicarious trauma that people experience while providing service? A simple example of this is if there's a sentinel event or a critical incident, how does that secondary trauma that's experienced in the client care process of hearing and healing the trauma experiences of clients come up, and how does vicarious trauma show up when a critical incident occurs in an organization? So when we look at these opportunities and try and maintain awareness in the application of trauma-informed care and supervision, we need to be able to distinguish between primary trauma, secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, and the influences of looking at compassion and empathy fatigue, right? Being able to look at emotional exhaustion or burnout as it's often referred to, and also be able to identify the opportunities and the understanding of compassion satisfaction, the true rewards of why we do the work we do and what we receive in the process of our work.
As a trauma-informed agency and supervisor, it's important to not only look at ourselves in terms of what are our self-care opportunities, you know, what can we do maybe within the agency? At the place I once worked at, we did the 7-minute workout every day at noon, which was fun, and you know, it helped, you know, alleviate some of the stress and get focused on the afternoon. You know, I know some organizations are doing yoga in their organization. I think, you know, really helping staff not feel guilty about self-care is crucial in a trauma-informed environment. And, you know, what kind of assessments and supervision are we doing with the people that we supervise? Are we really trying to assess, you know, Mary's got a mother who's in early dementia, and she's trying to balance that and getting her child to high school. And oh, by the way, she's going through a divorce. So, you know, how do you make it safe for people to balance all of those things? And what types of supports does the agency have with, you know, employee assistance? Does an agency have an employee assistance program that staff can be referred to and get the support and the resources that they need? And then, you know, part of supervision can be, you know, what's your self-care plan, and holding your supervisee accountable to that, you know, just like we would a client, because, you know, the people that we work with and next to have just as many needs for exercise and stress reduction as our clients. And then, you know, really truly understanding that supervision, there has to be an administrative component because we need to keep the agency funded, but there also has to be the clinical and self-awareness component. And then how does the agency balance that so that both of those needs are met for both the agency and the staff? So when we think about vicarious trauma, you know, this is something I believe that if we're in this profession, we've all experienced vicarious trauma. And that's just the exposure to the traumatic experiences of others. And we have to understand what those situations are. And oftentimes, I know in my experience, it's like I'm aware of it and then I'm on to the next thing. So it gets submerged, it gets put in the back of my mind, and then it comes out sometimes in really inappropriate times. It's like, where did that come from, right? So, you know, if we're working with people who have been victims of violence and trauma and we're absorbing their stories, that's all vicarious trauma, because we, you know, internally, you know, our neurotransmitters get stimulated just like theirs, maybe not to the same degree, but we do absorb that story and those feelings. And then what's really important is that a vicarious trauma-informed organization recognizes these challenges and they're proactive about addressing the impact of vicarious trauma through policies, procedures, practices, and programs, and making it okay. And just part of the reality of work is that we all experience this, and it's not a sign of weakness if we acknowledge it, that we're not superhuman and we're not super therapists. We're human beings, and it's really important that agencies and supervisors really look at vicarious trauma and how that gets played out with the people that we're working with.
So we take a pause to look at the LADAC ethical principles. And the ones that we've selected to include in this discussion are principle number 3, professional responsibilities and workplace standards. So when we talk about integrity, it's really about the individual integrity and the provider's integrity as an organization. Really being able to incorporate all the principles that we've been discussing so far in personal relationships and activities and professional relationship activities. Being able to recognize the role of our follow through, that our words have meaning and that our actions deliver those content really is the principle of integrity in this context. And so when we talk about supervision, how do we evaluate that follow through? How do we measure integrity, and how do we share growing integrity, not in terms of perfection, but in terms of practice? As Mary identified, practice makes progress. So how do we do that with clients, with peers, the public, honestly, accurately, and appropriately throughout all of our relationships? When we talk about supervision and consultation in particular, we need to look at impairment when we look at supervision as a whole. So supervisees, including interns and students, monitoring themselves for signs of physical, psychological, and emotional impairment. And as we discussed with vicarious trauma, really being able to, as supervisors from a trauma-informed lens, begin to understand and ask the questions to clarify what are the levels of impairment that people are experiencing and how can we support addressing those needs. So being able to seek that supervision and have opportunities as supervisees to request the resources of skills that may be in addition to the skills of our current supervisor is the responsibility of an organization. So when we look at trauma-informed organizational practices with integrity and impairment concerns and supervision, it's really being able to look at the institutional opportunity to address impairment at all levels, and being able to look at the resources within and outside of an organization and the willingness to seek those.
I would just like to add to that in terms of, you know, at some point an individual may work in an impaired organization, and no matter how hard you try to be adhere to these ethical considerations, it's okay to leave that impaired organization. I was in one and I ended up working in a store. Not that I did real well at it, but you know, I think it's really important to give yourself permission that if you're in an impaired organization and you don't feel like there's any opportunity to change the environment, find a way to leave and maybe get outside supervision that will help you find a way to leave. When we look at ethical considerations, loyalty, you know, I think most of us, or the majority of us that are in this profession, are very loyal people. You know, we work very long hours for very little money, and you know, we're willing to go above and beyond what's probably in the job description. So we have a responsibility not to abandon those we work with. And there are some organizations that have policies that are disloyal, and they do abandon the clients that we work with, or they are the same thing with staff. You know, one of the challenges of our profession is when we have a peer that relapses, and then what happens in that organization? Is there an employee assistance plan? Does it become the big secret that everybody talks about at the water cooler? Or does the person just get abruptly fired because they've relapsed in their disease? That wouldn't happen if they had had another occurrence of cancer or another cardiac incident. But loyalty is something, you know, we could spend a whole webinar on loyalty. The same thing with diligence. To work hard in our chosen profession, to be mindful and careful, and to make sure that we're thorough in our services so that are delivered. The other side of diligence is that sometimes we become over diligent and we end up working 60, 70, 80 hours a week, right? That flies in the face of our ethical principle in terms of self-care. So diligence can be both a blessing and a curse. It's something that we need balance for. And then non-malfeasance, first do no harm to the interests of the client, which we can all agree on, but we all have seen through the evolution of our profession where some of the policies that we have developed do malfeasance. They do take people out of treatment when they need it the most. And, you know, we have philosophical differences. I don't agree with the fact that brief treatment is real. So I'm not going to do brief treatment, even though it's evidence-based. I don't agree with the fact that, medication is a tool for the treatment of addiction. So I'm against all medication. So, we have both a responsibility to the individual, but we have a responsibility to really look at research and education and be open to what's coming, new. And, I just think that there's so much to doing no harm is really important. And we work with other institutions, whether it's criminal justice or child and family services, and their target and scope is very different than ours. And we have to adjust to decisions they make that are very harmful to the people that we're treating. So, it's been an ongoing struggle for me in my career, is how do I balance those competing interests that do cause harm to the client.
So when we dive into the definition of supervision, and again, yielding from the LADAC perspective, we need to look at the role of the supervisor or the consultant in the process, and being able to look at what are the steps to ensure that appropriate resources are available when providing supervision. Do supervisors rely on constant growth and knowledge in their own provision of supervision or consultation in an organization? And in that relationship, this opportunity for safety, trust, empowerment, choice, mutual responsibility, and compassion is ever present. So we want to acknowledge that often the principles of trauma-informed care are directly involved in supervision, but how aware and how open are we about acknowledging and communicating them? When we're offering supervisory or consultation services, supervisors have an obligation to review with our consultee or supervisee in writing and verbally the rights and responsibilities in that relationship for both parties. So we see clearly the opportunity is not just present, but it's the demand and the standard for mutual responsibility. So when there are changes in those opportunities or resources that we need to seek outside of our own skill sets, how do we acknowledge those? How do we recognize those? How do we incorporate those? And how do we build those into our supervision as an opportunity for teaching, for learning, for growth, for increasing safety, trust, and all of the principles of trauma-informed care? And we need to acknowledge that there are limits to confidentiality, specifically when we're talking about differentiating between primary trauma, secondary trauma, and vicarious trauma, that supervisees and supervisors have a responsibility to participate in. So how does that information get shared, and what are the protocols? How clear and concise is the definition of supervision provided? And then we talk about the client care process. Most supervision in most organizations focuses on the case management process, and a little bit less in the clinical realm on the development of a supervisee or a supervisor's opportunities for growth. So we want to discuss some trauma-informed supervision tools to share with everyone. If you're familiar, we certainly don't want to be pedantic, but if you're unfamiliar, one standard opportunity that's free and accessible is the Professional Quality of Life Scale, or the ProQOL-5. Right? It's a self-assessment tool that involves a Likert scale, and it measures both compassion and empathy fatigue and compassion satisfaction. It's a 30-question self-assessment that can be used and should be used regularly to engage in supervision process, to be able to help understand where a person's needs are, where their opportunities are, and where their growth is present. So when we talk about the principles of trauma-informed care, in this process, engaging a tool like the ProQOL-5 is a wonderful opportunity to be able to demonstrate safety, trust, collaboration, choice, empowerment, mutual responsibility, cultural humility, all of these principles in one simple tool. One of the opportunities in the language and in the literature that has been present for a number of years is the use of reflective supervision. So different than directive supervision, reflective supervision is relationally driven and focuses on the relationships between the supervisee and the supervisor, and the relational content and all the provider's opportunities. It really focuses on seeking to be developmentally appropriate, so really understanding from a compassion and a cultural humility standpoint, where is the supervisee's opportunity for growth and what stage of their career development and provider development is present. It's culturally responsive by being able to attend to things beyond cultural competence and really being able to look at that culturally humble perspective of the individual supervisee's needs and how they provide their service with their target population in their service. And through this reflective supervision process, it really does mitigate vicarious trauma and decreases staff turnover. And numerous organizations have found the opportunity of being able to measure this as part of their outcomes and measurement-based care standards. So when we look at integrating trauma-informed care principles into existing supervision practices, an opportunity can be as simple as being able to take those core principles of trauma-informed care and being able to engage in supervision both administratively and clinically by asking for one's own self-assessment. How do you feel you're doing with safety? How do you feel you're doing with trustworthiness and transparency? And for a supervisor to be able to say in the same engagement, assess me as a supervisor. How am I providing safety for you? How do you feel that you're receiving my trustworthiness and transparency? Are there opportunities for us to collaborate? How am I engaging in peer support opportunities with you? Being able to do something as simple as incorporating those principles into your current supervision tools and processes is a beginning way to integrate trauma-informed supervision into your organization.
So when we try to conceptualize integrating trauma with supervision, we have to really acknowledge, of course, that the prevalence of trauma is throughout our organization. And even the people who are maybe not clinical in our organization, I think we have to understand where their vicarious trauma comes from. It could just be working with all of us, right? And maybe they have their own history of trauma as well. So sometimes there's there's the business people and there's the clinical people. And how do you get those two worlds together? And understanding that trauma affects everybody in the organization, whether it's something that happens to one of the clients or whether it happens to one of the staff, whether it happens in our community or with the greater world, right? COVID has certainly been traumatic for all of us. And how are staff responding to that? And then how do we resist re-traumatization? Being aware of the policies and procedures and practices that won't re-traumatize our staff and our coworkers. And then really putting into practice through procedures, through case conferences, through supervision, through team meetings and staff training, trauma-informed practices, so that when everybody comes to work, it's like, there's a sigh of relief, not a lump in your throat, because you're going back into an environment that is so painful to deal with. And I think that, the more we can learn as supervisors about how trauma affects our environment, if I have, if my office is very sterile and unwelcoming, how trauma informed is that? If I have someone who I'm working with that has a physical disability, does my office and does the organization accommodate for that physical disability? And I think it's just really important that we take a step back and have a very broad view of the environment that we create for our staff as well.
So essentially, our discussion of trauma-informed supervision is really being able to acknowledge how we integrate this through an organization. Often human resource practices present as in conflict with trauma-informed care and trauma-informed practices. But is there an opportunity for us to be able to integrate these principles at an administrative level? And the answer is a clear yes. So beginning with interviewing, does the interview process assess for trauma-informed knowledge and skill? Right? So do we look at updated job descriptions being shared at the very beginning of an interview process when we're onboarding an employee into an organization? Right? Or do we wait until after the person is hired, share the description, ask them to sign, and make sure that they read that last little bullet point that says other duties as assigned without being clear in those opportunities? There are opportunities for applicants to address emotional and physical safety concerns during the interview process for both the job responsibilities and the environment. Are we as an organization open to feedback during an interview process, or are we really looking to see how we can fill a slot for billable services? In a trauma-informed human service or human resource process, a prolonged orientation process really is in place where there's an investment in staff as opposed to orienting someone after the fact, handing them the checklist and asking them to sign, even if the tasks weren't clear, weren't appropriate, and weren't clearly understood.
Many organizations will have a very broad orientation process, excuse me, where the new staff person is given a schedule and they're given a time to meet with the doctor, they're given a time to meet with the team leader, they're given a time to meet with transportation. And it's vital that all of those different departments honor that schedule. That I can't tell you how many times somebody's been given an orientation schedule, and when you go to review with them at the end of the week, well, so-and-so didn't have time. So-and-so had to do an outreach. So-and-so had to take the van to the gas station. So it's really important that not only does the orientation schedule get done, but the whole organization understands how important that orientation process is. And when you don't follow it, that can be traumatic for people, right? It's like, what did I get myself into? You know, this is the same old, same old. People are going to tell me one thing and do another. So, and that initial expectations are clearly communicated between the employer and the supervisor, that there's no surprises after somebody gets hired, that if you need to be on call, that needs to be talked about before you hire someone. If you're expected to use your own vehicle and have insurance for that vehicle, that needs to be talked about ahead of time. If the person has an accommodation that they need, it's important that the staff makes that accommodation known so that there's transparency and collaboration on both sides. The onboarding process includes personal and agency-wide safety measures and procedures. If you're going out in the community, do you have a kit for bloodborne pathogens? Are you taking Narcan out with you? You know, do you have an up-to-date CPR and first aid? So those are kinds of things that the agency can provide that will enhance the new staff and any staff's safety, right? And that the employee transitions are clearly and consistently communicated in the entire organization in a timely manner with dignity, respect, and safety. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges between trauma-informed agencies and HR laws, that oftentimes there's a corrective action in place between a staff person and the agency that no one knows about, right, for confidentiality. That's, you know, practice as usual. But then, unbeknownst to everybody, that corrective action reached its end, and Jonathan is no longer working here as of 3 o'clock this afternoon. So then what happens? What happens to Jonathan's clients? They have questions. All the families that Jonathan's working with and have bonded with are, they're feeling abandoned. The clients are feeling abandoned. His coworkers are feeling abandoned. And, you know, this is to me one of the biggest areas of vicarious trauma. It's so sad when, you know, an employee quote unquote gets let go, And the next day you sit down with a client and they say, oh, I'm used to this. You know, people leave all the time. I just think that's something we really need to take a hard look at, because I don't think the business world truly understands the sacred relationship that we have with our clients, and that all of the transference and countertransference that goes into that. And when somebody abruptly leaves, that's traumatizing. And for many people, it's a recreation of family. It's a recreation of many traumatic events in their life.
So when we look at the opportunity to really be able to explore what does trauma-informed organizational implementation look like, we want to honor and respect that trying to implement trauma-specific clinical practices without first implementing trauma-informed organizational culture change is like throwing seeds on dry land. And that's a quote from Dr. Sandra Bloom, the creator of the sanctuary model. So to be able to do this and to be able to put the context of doing trauma-informed supervision into practice, I want to share some organizational tools to help assess and understand what the opportunity is for integrating trauma-informed care throughout an organization. The first is the Trauma-Informed Organizational Capacity Scale, or the TIC scale. It includes 35 items across 5 domains and includes building trauma-informed knowledge and skills within an organization and staff, looking and examining, establishing trusting relationships within the organization and the staff, respecting the service users and understanding the difference between staff as service users and participants and clients as service users and participants. The Trauma-Informed Organizational Capacity Scale measures and looks at fostering trauma-informed service delivery as a portion of it from the foundation of what's needed in an organization to be able to deliver it with integrity, and promotes trauma-informed procedures and policy development by being able to offer an evaluation in these domains and opportunities to explore where to integrate these policies into practice. The other opportunity is the attitudes related to trauma-informed care, the Arctic scale, which is the first psychometrically valid measure that's in peer-reviewed literature, and being able to look at the Arctic measures favorable or unfavorable attitudes of service providers towards trauma-informed care. So as a baseline of understanding an organization's needs, really being able to, much like the stages of change, evaluate where service providers in an organization have as their attitudes and understanding of trauma-informed care as the starting point. The Arctic scale offers 3 different depths based on organizational need of a brief 10-question survey, a deeper 35-question opportunity, and the deepest of 45 questions to be able to help understand the current attitudes and opportunities for growth and change in an organization. And these aren't the only exclusive tools, but 2 opportunities, and in our resource slide at the end of this presentation, links for both are available. The key for us in this discussion when we talk about trauma-informed supervision is to really understand that it can't be done in isolation and that wouldn't be a trauma-informed practice. And to be able to have an organizational understanding of what the needs, opportunities are is really critical for an organization to be able to effectively deliver and implement and sustain trauma-informed supervision.
So when we think about trauma-informed care integration in an agency, do all levels of leadership understand trauma-informed care? Are they all committed to providing trauma-informed care not only for the clients, but for the staff? Does the mission reflect the importance of trauma-informed care on all levels, whether it's vicarious or primary or secondary? It's, you know, when you go back and you look at your leadership team and your mission, you know, compare trauma-informed principles to the practices that you experience.
When it comes to integrating trauma-informed care with management and supervision, how aligned are management and supervision resources within the organization? And again, we understand that the opportunity is to integrate administrative and clinical supervision together in a process that identifies, responds, remains aware, and meets the staff's needs in meeting the client's needs within the community.
When we talk about employee empowerment and work environment, I mentioned before in terms of You know, does the environment support people with disabilities? Is it friendly? Is it, when you walk in, is it hopeful? Or does it feel like you're going into a jail and everything is locked and you're behind all these different screens and windows, which I understand under COVID, that's one thing. But do people smile when you walk into a room or into an office, or are people glued to their monitors? And when we talk about employee empowerment, do employees understand the rules that the organization needs to abide by? Do they understand the regulations that the state or the credentialing bodies are imposing upon the organization, so that they have a broader context of why some decisions are made? And you know, how much are employees really encouraged to come in, sit down, and talk about their experience of their work environment? A lot of organizations do surveys and think that that's employee feedback, and they might be done once a year, and like 3 months later they're reviewed, and maybe 6 months later you know, they're talked about. So, you know, how responsive is an organization to the suggestions and concerns of the staff?
Are the training and professional development opportunities present in the organization oriented to trauma-informed care? Really being able to say that we want to look beyond just the required regulatory or accreditation standards for training and professional development, but we want to deep dive and say, in the performance improvement and quality assurance planning the organization participates, do those training opportunities responsively attend to what's identified in both administrative and clinical supervision? Do we offer the same trainings every year with the same providers? Do we diversify and look for the best expert to be able to supply the training and professional development opportunities for the resources for the staff on a moment-to-moment basis, evolving as the organization grows? So when we talk about this opportunity, we're looking at training and development. It's really integrating things like trauma-informed care training as a foundational element, and being able to build on the expertise and mastery of the implementation of these skills through professional development over time in the organization.
When we talk about staff health and wellness, that's a broad spectrum of trauma-informed principles, right? So there's the basic staff health. Is there affordable insurance, or does the agency try to cut costs by having expensive insurance with a really high deductible, or very cheap insurance, but there's a $5,000 or a $7,000 deductible? In terms of wellness, are staff encouraged to leave after 8 hours, or are they encouraged to stay for 9 or 10 to get the documentation done? You know, and is anybody monitoring that? Because that might be a system problem. Maybe there's not enough access to the electronic medical record. Maybe there's you know, there's time management on the part of the staff, but oftentimes that's a systems issue. When you've got people staying late, that's usually that there's a lot to do and not enough people to do it. And, you know, does the agency really look at trauma-informed principles when it comes to staff health and wellness? You know, staff are our biggest asset, and it should be our biggest investment, because retaining staff is far more economical than continuous turnover, and clients benefit from continuity. They don't do well in chaos. They're used to chaos, but they don't thrive in chaos. That's why they're with us. So I really think it's important to look at, from an agency and supervisor perspective, how are we encouraging staff health and wellness?
So in planning great trauma-informed supervision, we really want to emphasize the need for baseline organizational health, for understanding what are the current supervision supports and resources, to be able to, within an organization, to identify, to discuss, and to solve gaps in service coverage and area with supervision, and look for those integrating opportunities. So really understanding what the organizational context is critical for being able to plan and implement trauma-informed care. Part of every organization is having an organizational health plan. And again, it's often disguised in the language of performance improvement or quality improvement. But the truth is that that is an organizational health plan. But is that plan inclusive of integrating trauma-informed care opportunities specific to administrative and clinical supervision? So what works best for your organization is really being based on what the organization does as its expertise and what they need uniquely for that organization to grow. Are all of the elements of organizational attunement present for an integrative approach? Once we implement, do we look at it as just prevention and maintenance or sustainability? And when we're planning this, can we be realistic about the goals and achievable in delivering this with integrity throughout the process? Trauma-informed care, we want to emphasize, always begins with safety. And to quote colleagues Rick Dower and Dan Griffin, co-authors of the Helping Men Recover curriculum, safety should be first, last, and always. But following safety ultimately is the opportunity for us to be present, to be clear, and to demonstrate our trust through integrity, sincerity, reliability, and consistency. I recently was speaking with a supervisor of mine and said that trust equals consistency over time as the simplest formula. So when we talk about the essential foundation of trauma-informed care supervision, we need to begin with safety and trust as our foundation before going any further into more complex operations and integrations. At this time, with the few minutes that we have left, we'd like to open up for questions, and we'll be opening up the question box and attending to some of the questions that are present already. So one of our questions is directed for Mary, and would you like to answer that?
I would love to. That was an example. I definitely believe in brief therapy. I use motivational interviewing all the time. I was using those two as examples of how some people that we work with, that our peers, do not believe in brief therapy. They do not believe in medication management. I was using those as an example of staff needing to be able to be open-minded and grow. So I was in no way at all, and I'm sorry if that came across that way. That was just an example.
So another question coming in from our audience is, how do we assess trauma with staff without becoming a therapist? So in the supervision process and the organizational process, how do we attend to that primary, secondary trauma distinction and vicarious trauma? So how do we assess without being someone's provider?
So I think, first of all, it's important to have agency policies for primary and secondary trauma. Are we doing critical incident debriefing? I think, you know, I've always just assumed that people have some form of trauma. That's one of the reasons that they are drawn to this field, right? So I think we can have discussions about it, and if we have policies that promote wellness and health, that someone can then go get help. We don't need to be the therapist, but we certainly need to be able to help the people we supervise identify their own vicarious trauma and their secondary trauma.
Thank you, Mary. In addition to that, something to consider is being able to look at the supervision tools that we use currently in an organization, and how do they acknowledge being able to point to resources appropriately where we're not trying to be the assessing provider, but being able to, in a mutual responsibility relationship with this, within supervision, being able to ask those open questions of looking at particular stress, anxiety, and the symptoms of traumatic stress, and asking the individual if this is related to their own opportunity and if they can differentiate. And therein comes the skill of the supervisor and being able then to offer opportunities to direct resource for professional assessment outside of an organization. So another question coming in from the audience is, where can I get some information on how to develop trauma-informed care policies? One opportunity for those familiar with the SAMHSA tip series is tip 57, which we have a link in our a resource page to, provides a tremendous wealth of information on developing trauma-informed care policies and practices for organizations as a starting point. But I think there are a number of resources. Some excellent resources that I've identified as well are the work of Dr. Sandra Bloom and her sanctuary model as an example of how to integrate organizational change with trauma-informed practices. Mary, are there other resources you can think of in the minute that we have left?
I think that's a good place to start. And there are, in the tip, there are other resources that you can look into. But this is a top-down process. If your senior leadership isn't involved and signs off on it, it's going to be much more difficult to implement trauma-informed practices and policies.
Well, we hope that answers all your questions, and we really want to take a moment to thank you for joining us as we've reached the top of our time today. Thank you so much for joining us today. There'll be a brief poll coming up for sharing feedback at the end of this session, and there'll be an email for those of you to respond to us directly with further questions and unanswered opportunities that we weren't able to attend to. Feel free to reach out to us at www.c4-consulting.com. And thank you so much for joining us today.